gospel of our Savior Jesus Christ according to Luke.
Glory be to you, Lord.
On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. When he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor, in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, give this person your place. And then, in disgrace, you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. He said also to the one who had invited him, when you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, or your brothers, or your relatives, or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return, and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you. For you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. The gospel of the Lord.
Praise be to thee, O Christ.
Honor is not something we take onto ourselves. Honor is bestowed. This is the wisdom of the first half of today's gospel. Jesus says, do not take honor upon yourself, because that's not how it works. Honor must be offered. Honor must be given. So in yourself, take the lowest place, become a servant, and then if it's appropriate, when it's appropriate, the honor will be granted to you. You will be identified. You will be raised up. You will be told to come up higher. That's how honor works. He goes on to say in the second half of today's parable, when you're doing something, don't do it in such a way that you know you're going to get something back for it. Now look, it's Labor Day weekend. We're all having maybe a cookout of some kind. Maybe you haven't invited the blind and the lame yet to your party. But look at what Jesus is saying sort of at its heart. He's saying there is a way of doing parties where it's kind of like, let's invite the fancy people in town to our party, and then they'll invite us to their party. And it's sort of this backhanded way to get an invitation into their home, right? To get a place in so that you can eat all their food. It's this idea of let's bring the fancy people here so that now each of the fancy people owe us, and we'll give them one meal and then we'll get 10 meals. And Jesus is saying this is not the ideal way. Again, just as honor is bestowed, so when you give without a desire to receive, you are setting the stage for God to honor you. You don't need to be honored by those in your circle. These two concepts come to mind together with the idea that the bishop is coming next week. And it's made me want to stop and take a moment in our parish life, in the circle of our seasons, to remind you where we come from, and to remind you how this whole church was born. And as you hear this story, I want you to listen to the themes of today's gospel, and listen for the people who were giving with the idea that they would get back, and disregarding those of small estate. And meanwhile, those who were inviting into their presence, those who couldn't repay. And look at where you see the blessings. Our church was founded by, thanks be to God, we have a photograph, Elisabeth Denison Forth. Elisabeth Denison Forth. You've seen her picture, but it's always nice to see again. Elisabeth, her family called her Lisette, was born as a slave in Michigan. Her whole family was owned by the Tuckers, by William Tucker and his wife Catherine. Now, William had been taken captive at the age of 11 by the Chippewa. We don't have anything more about that story. It's not clear how it happened, but the Chippewa Indians took him captive at the age of 11. They raised him as one of them, and it makes me think that he knew what it was like to lose your family, to be a captive, and to be at the servitude of others, right? As nice as the Chippewa may have been to him, he was taken from his family, right? As wonderful as his life might have been with the Indians, he was a captive, and they kept him. It's interesting sometimes how trauma reflects itself down through the generations. Because later on, as William became into his 18, he came into his 20s, he went to Virginia, he found a spouse there. He may have seen in Virginia this wonderful institution some people called slavery, where for just a couple bucks you could buy a human being and keep them for the rest of their lives. And so he comes back to Michigan. The Chippewa Indians give him a 3-mile parcel along the Clinton River. He and his wife start up a family, they start up a farm, and they decide, wouldn't it be wonderful to have some slaves? They hire Hannah in 1780, and Hannah is helping Catherine in the household. And they go and buy for 300 pounds, the low price of 300 pounds, British. They buy Peter in 1784. Now, Peter and Hannah were allowed to get married. Were they forced to get married? Did they have any options at all? Were they allowed to go and to meet, to visit other people, to pursue the dreams of their hearts, right? To find the person that was their beloved. They found each other, and they probably needed each other. And by all accounts, they raised good children. So it looks like they were a loving family. And yet still they were slaves. Peter and Hannah were allowed to get married. Of course they were allowed to get married. You know why? Because over the course of time, they had 6 children, and guess what? The Tuckers owned them all. They bought 2 slaves, and they ended up with 8. Isn't this wonderful? Isn't it fantastic? William, who himself was a captive, has now got himself captives. And he keeps them the rest of his natural life. The 2 of them, Peter and Hannah, as I said, eventually have 6 children, and it looks like Lisette was either the first or the second. Later on during a court case, Catherine could say that she could remember the eras the children were born in, but she really wasn't sure what year it was. She knew when she was born. She knew the birth dates of each of her children. She knew her husband's birthday. But the slave kids, she really wasn't sure. Apparently it wasn't quite as important to her. That's how it sounds to me. William Tucker had been a colonel in the Revolutionary War, after all, the 1770s, the 1780s. And he would invite British soldiers to his house. Chippewa Indians and others of the 6 nations would sometimes come through. So it's said that Lisette and some of the kids, that all 3 of the races would play together. That the Indian children and the white children and the black children would all play together. And you can sort of imagine what that would look like, sort of like the equality perhaps among children, and then the reflection of all of the adults standing around them, and the dramatic inequality that it would become as they become older. We might think about the plight of the Indians, but that's not today's sermon. William Tucker dies in 1805. It looks like Lisette was apparently born sometime before 1793. So we might guess 1790 or so if we were going to pick a date, because she and her 3 siblings were all, the first 3, were all born before 1793. In 1805, William Tucker died. And in his will, he left to his wife, Peter and Hannah. Isn't it wonderful to leave human beings in your will? So that not only are they yours for your natural life, but then you can give them to others and they become theirs as well. This is I'm thinking a lot about sort of William in the context of Jesus' parable today, where William hung out with British soldiers. He hung out with the Macomb brothers who owned thousands of acres of land. He would go to their house. They would come to his house. I forgot to mention that Lisette's grandmother, who also was named Lisette, was owned by the Macombs. So Lisette was allowed to go visit her grandparents when her slave owners got together with her grandmother's slave owners, and they decided they wanted to spend some time together. And then Lisette would have wonderful moments, perhaps, with her grandmother when they were allowed. In 1805, William Tucker died. He left Peter and Hannah, Lisette's parents, to his wife, Catherine, and said that they could be hers as long as she lived. And when she eventually died, which she would in 43 more years, they would be set free. But not the children. The children, when his wife died, including Lisette, would be passed down to his sons so that they could keep the children throughout their natural-born lives and perhaps the children of their future marriages as well. Here's where Lisette's story takes a wonderful turn. It's sort of like the grace of God kind of intervenes. Because Catherine, William Tucker's wife, did not particularly need Hannah and Peter's help at that time, perhaps because Lisette and the others were now in their teens and early 20s and were able to be very helpful. So Catherine decided that Peter and Hannah could be leased out to Elijah Brush, who was a lawyer in the Detroit area. Elijah Brush would become a kind of person like the second half of today's gospel. The kind of person who is willing to give without any expectation of return, who is willing to bless even though the people he was blessing couldn't do anything for him. And why? Simply because it felt right, simply because it felt good, simply because it felt like a divine thing to do. God gives us his grace freely. Give your grace freely. He gives free legal advice to Peter and Hannah and says, I'm a lawyer, let's get a court case going, let's set your children free. This probably wasn't Catherine's idea when she sent them to a lawyer. But lo and behold, they went to the lawyer in 1806, and there was a court case later that year in front of the Supreme Court of the Territory of Michigan. Judge Augustus Woodward presiding, a name we know well in Detroit. And Woodward said, sadly, the youngest of the children may be set free, but the older 3, including Lisette, are grandfathered into this clause where we're not allowed to take territory away from the French. And since when Lisette was born, it was technically a part of Canadian territory. The United States has no authority to do anything to them. And so the 3 of them were left with this prospect of a lifetime of forced servitude and bondage. And yet, 3 months later, Augustus Woodward decided a second case. And it was about Canadian slaves who were coming across the border, and the question was, is the United States required to give these slaves back to their owners in Canada? And Woodward decided, again in a Supreme Court case, that no, the United States did not have to give Canadian slaves back to their Canadian owners if they had come to the United States and were now citizens of the United States. Elijah Brush had a wonderful idea. It may have been part of the birth of the Underground Railroad, this particular Supreme Court case, because, of course, Supreme Court cases in states and territories echo around other states and territories. They're quoted. The logic is followed. The logic was, if you become a Canadian citizen, then you can come back to the United States and you can be free. Lisette and 2 of her, at least one of her brothers, you know, the records aren't perfectly clear on the Underground Railroad. It was underground. right? And for a reason. We don't keep good records of the slaves we're helping to set free here. But for sure, Lisette and one of her brothers and went over to Canada and stayed for a period of time that could have been as long as 8 or 9 years. It could have been as short as maybe 2 or 3. Now, think about for a second the location here of St. James. This chapel that we've already mentioned, Lisette is instrumental in creating. And we look out the front door and what do we see? We see the River Jordan, the Detroit River, and we see the Promised Land, Canada. Where once we cross it, we go into the land of freedom, right? We go into the land of blessing. We go into the land where God is our Father and no one else has any authority over us at all. Imagine the courage. Lisette is now in her early 20s. She spent her whole life as a slave. There's these Supreme Court cases, giant gears turning on a national scale, and what she knows is if she flees to another country, across a river to a place that she doesn't know, she can find freedom, and so she goes. And so she goes. And Elijah Brush actually sets them up with his in-laws, because the woman he married was Canadian, and her parents lived in Canada. And it looks like Elisabeth and her family land there. They have to stay for some time because they have to become citizens. She comes back across the river sometime around, imagine now, the War of 1812, right? Happening right here across the river. Detroit was taken for a year in 1812 until it was recaptured by the United States in 1813. And sometime during this time, it looks like Lisette and her family come back across the Detroit River. They worked for, Elijah Brush has now died. They worked for Elijah's widow. But notice the subtle difference of now they're working for her as free people, as employees. They're working for her at will, and they are receiving wages, and they can choose anything they want, and this is what they get to choose. Lisette begins to work for Adelaide Brush, works for her for a period of maybe 5 or 10 years, and then goes into the employ, chooses to go into the hands of and household of Solomon Sibley. Sibley Gardens, anyone? Sibley Road, downtown, or not so far away. Solomon Sibley, who was the first mayor of Detroit in, I believe it was 1834, was the first year that Detroit was incorporated as a city. Solomon Sibley, it was 1-year terms, was the first mayor. He was also significant in the military. He was significant in Michigan's House of Representatives. She goes to work for his household, and one of the first things she does, and it looks a little bit like she must have gotten good advice from Solomon Sibley. Again, look at the people giving blessings with no expectation of return. The next thing you know, Lisette is buying 48, I think, point something acres of land in Pontiac, which she will keep for the rest of her life. She will lease out to various people, some family members, some others, for the rest of her life, and will be now receiving income from that leasing for the next 50 years of her life. She is now investing her money and watching these things grow, something she never could have had without the freedom. And Solomon Sibley seems to be instrumental in helping her. By some accounts, Elisabeth Denison Forth is the first black female property owner in the state of Michigan ever. And she's the person who helped to create us. She works for Solomon Sibley's household for about 10 or 12 years, from her early 30s until maybe her early to mid 40s, when she then takes a job with the Biddles. The Biddles? Anyone? The Biddles? All of these last names, if you're watching online, you may not know, but all these names are well known down the river. Where she stays with the Biddles for the next 30 years. She is by all accounts an expert at what she does. Just so you think back about what it took to run a household and run a family in the 1830s and 1840s. Dishwashers not invented. Yeah, we have dishwashers. They're called fingers and hands and elbows, right? And things were difficult. Teflon not yet invented, right? She would take care of 3 meals a day. The Biddles had 3 children, a 10-year-old, a 6-year-old, a 1-year-old. Guess who was taking care of the kids? Guess who was watching over them when they were sick? She actually, there's several reports of her having like medical knowledge, as I guess like women who took care of kids would pass on to each other, and who knows, maybe she learned some things from the Indians, but like when the kids were ill, when they had fevers, when the babies had, what's it called when they cry incessantly? Colic. I always think this is a colic. What's this called?
That's a cow.
Cowlick. That's why I confused it. Anyway, when the kids have not cowlick, but colic, she was making medicines for them. She was making sure the ingredients would come in. She was coming up with interesting new recipes, and the family said, often surprising her. The Biddles, of the 3 kids, they would have several more. William was the youngest. Willie, he was one, and he was her favorite. And Willie would become important as we begin to wrap up her story. Later, James would be born. Willie and James both become significant in her story at the end. And several other children as well. She continues to raise them, continues to take care of the household, works for the Biddles for 30 years. They so care for her. They are so proud of her that when Mrs. Biddle is sick, and you know how back in the days it was like, you know what, you're really sick. What you should do is go to France for a few years. Have you heard this? It's like, the air here is too thick. You should go to Europe And so they did. They went to France for 2 years, and they brought Lisette with them. And there's letters from Mrs. Biddle talking about how like all of the French cooks have their like noses out of joint because Lisette cooks so well. And they can't figure out how to match her buckwheat cakes, which she cooked on a griddle, but seems to have cooked on a griddle in an oven. So I'm not sure if they're cakes or pancakes or what, but I've made buckwheat pancakes, and they were shoe rubber. So I think there must be a certain skill and tactic that she had figured out. She didn't love it when she was in Paris, and the family would say, "We're going to Italy. We really couldn't possibly bring you. We're leaving you behind." She didn't like it when they said, "We're going to Germany, but we really couldn't possibly take you." And the next thing you know, here she is stuck in Paris all by herself, having been brought across the ocean. And like the family that she's like there for is traipsing across Europe, deciding not to bring her. But she always really loved it when they came back. And it said they came back with gifts, so we'll see how that goes. When she comes back from Europe, she's now in her early 60s. During somewhere in this time, she, seemingly through the help of the Sibleys, bought shares in a steamboat company, which went gangbusters. In 1 year, brought back like over 80% in profit. She bought shares in a bank, which itself was also doing super well. Several years later, with some of the income from there, she bought some property in Detroit. So now she owned property in Pontiac, property in Detroit. She owned a cow and asked from Paris, "Tell me how my cow is doing." She was very concerned about her dogs, as each of us would be. Who's watching the dogs? Are they all right? She was worried about the cow. Was the cow all right? And so she was also during this time continuing to amass like in wealth and also prestige. And I think also, if you look at this picture, a sense of like, a proper sense of like pride, job well done. She comes back, and the Sibleys, and the Biddles, I'm sorry, I got that backwards, the Biddles don't. So she begins to work now for William. This little Willie, who she had inherited at the age of 1, went to Harvard. That little boy went to Harvard. He got a Harvard education. He became a lawyer. He came back to Michigan, and she passes into his household and begins to now take care of his children as well. He and James, I had mentioned, when they were young, used to go to a boys' school on Grosse Ile. The Biddles had founded Wyandotte as like a home. They named it after the Indians. They thought that was a really interesting name to give their home. And they had gone to a boys' school that was right here on this property, where the main church is, run by an Episcopal priest. And Lisette had gone to Episcopal churches all throughout her life, confirmed in her late 40s at St. Paul's Church, which is now the cathedral. Now that she comes into William's household, she writes her fourth will, and she's thinking about the fullness of her life. And she says, I want $50 to go from my will to all of my sort of nephews and nieces. I want $100 to go to each of my closest relatives. I want whatever, if I have any outstanding bills or anything, for that to be paid from the will. And I want everything else to go to building a fine Episcopal chapel where the pews are free and anyone of any background can come, the rich and the poor, worship side by side, hear God's word side by side, receive the body and blood of Christ side by side as equals. A church, a place where in God's sight and in human sight, everyone is of equal dignity. It was popular at this time not to make pledges to the church, but to rent the pews. And guess what? The rich people, not the front ones. Why? Because they got to walk all the way to the front. Oh, we must be in the front today. Everybody got to see them. And then walking out, they got to walk out and have everybody see them. And the poorer you were in the back, and if you didn't have much money at all, as many African Americans did at this time, I'm so sorry, there just may not be any pews for you today. You may need to stand, or you just might not be able to worship here at this church. Not at the church she was founding. She left $1,500, which I looked at what that value would be today, and the value in like buying power for a building, including like labor and materials, was the equivalent of somewhere between $250,000 and $500,000 that she had. She was married briefly for 3 years and her husband died, so she had no other heirs. So then she gives this $250,000 to $500,000 to William, little Willie, who she started taking care of when he was 1, and said, please help this dream to become a reality. His mother had died about 6 months earlier, so he matched her gift. The records we have say a couple people gave a little bit here and there, and that money, that sort of partnership money between Lisette and the mother of the house, Lisette's dream, but matched also by Mrs. Biddle, who they worked side by side in this household. Those dollars together built this place in 1867, consecrated in 1868, and has been here ever since. Who were the people in this story who gave because they were expecting in return and didn't even notice the poor, the needy, the downtrodden? Do they appear to be villains or heroes in this story? It's almost like what Jesus was saying was deeply true. Who are the people in this story who gave generously, who offered without any desire for return, who gave simply because it was good, simply because it was needed? And look at the fruits of those works. Do they come off as heroes or as villains? It seems that Jesus knows what he's talking about today, asking us to emulate those who show up best in the stories of our lives. The people who give freely, the people who are willing to serve gently, the people who live their lives as servants, to give to other people the opportunity to look at them and say, you may have been a servant in your life, but come up higher. Come up higher. You should sit in the front row today, because you may not have given yourself such honor.